Now you can commence.
Perfect. So, good day, keynote speakers, colleagues, researchers, practitioners, policymakers, doctoral scholars, students, and friends joining us from different parts of the world. I'm Dr. Sudhanshu Bhatt, Director of University Relations at Sanjeevani University, India, and it gives me immense pleasure to welcome all of you to Transformative Transport Conference 2026. On behalf of TransEdi and the entire organizing team, thank you for being part of this conference, and more importantly, for becoming part of a conversation that continues to grow in both its reach and its relevance. Over successive editions, TTC has evolved from being simply a conference into an increasingly diverse international community. We see that diversity today in the disciplines represented here, in the countries and contexts from which our participants join us, and in the remarkably different mobility challenges that that are presented, bringing to this platform. We are very excited about today's event, and we are connected by one common concern: how can transport work better for people? Now, that question is deceptively simple. Transport is often discussed through roads, railways, buses, vehicles, infrastructure, technology, efficiency, and increasingly through algorithms and digital platforms. But behind every one of these systems is a person trying to reach somewhere that matters. Someone is trying to reach a workplace, a student is trying to reach a university, a farmer is trying to reach a market, a patient is trying to reach healthcare, a woman is deciding whether a journey is safe enough to make, a person with disability is asking whether a service designed for everyone actually includes them. And perhaps this is where the idea of transformative transport really begins. The Transformative Transport Conference emerges from the work of TransEdi, the Transformative Transport Service Design Initiative. At the heart of TransEdi is the belief that transport should not merely facilitate movement, it should also contribute to better human and societal outcomes. Its work therefore creates connections between researchers, practitioners, policymakers, communities, and other actors concerned with the future of mobility. This interdisciplinary character is especially important because none of the challenges we are discussing today belongs neatly to one discipline. Sustainable mobility cannot be solved by engineering alone. Accessibility cannot be understood through infrastructure alone. Technology cannot be evaluated through efficiency alone. And transport policy cannot succeed without understanding the people whose everyday lives are shaped by those decisions. Transformative transport therefore requires us to speak with one another rather than past one another. As transport engineers may see infrastructure, a technology researcher may see data, a policymaker may see regulation, a business scholar may see a service ecosystem, a commuter simply sees whether they can get where they need to go safely, affordably, reliably, and with dignity. TTC creates a space where these perspectives can meet. The central conversation of this conference asks us to reimagine transport as a service for inclusive and sustainable future. I find the word service particularly important here because it changes how we evaluate transportation. Instead of asking only whether infrastructure exists, we begin asking whether that infrastructure actually enables meaningful participation in society. A road matter because it connects the community. A bus matter because somehow somebody depends upon it. A digital mobility platform matters because it can expand access, but it can also create new forms of exclusion. Accessibility matters because the ability to move should not depend upon whether a person conforms to the assumptions under which a transport system was originally designed. Seen in this way, transportation becomes much more than movement from one geographical point to another. It becomes a service ecosystem shaping access, opportunity, participation, dignity, and quality of life. This human centered understanding is already embedded in the way TTC approaches transportation. Our conversation today broadly converges around three interconnected concerns: sustainability, inclusivity, and technology. Sustainability asks us to consider not simply how transport can become greener, but how mobility systems can remain environmentally responsible, economically viable, socially accessible, and resilient over time. The question is therefore not simply whether we can reduce emissions, but whether we can create sustainable mobility without reducing access for those who already experience transport disadvantage. Inclusivity asks perhaps an even more fundamental question: who is a transport system actually designed for? A transport system can be technically efficient and yet socially inequitable. A service may exist because it remains practically inaccessible. A digital platform may create extraordinary convenience for some passengers while creating another barrier for others. And what appears to be ordinary journey for one person may represent considerable physical, financial, psychological, or social difficulty for another. That is why discussions of gender, disability, neurodivergence, informal mobility, rural communities, safety, access, and transport justice are not just peripheral to the transport debate. They are very central to it. And then there is technology. AI, digital platforms, machine learning, electric mobility, data driven services, and smart transport systems are rapidly changing what transportation can become. There is enormous potential here, but technological possibility should always be accompanied by a second question. Not simply, what can this technology do? But for whom does it create value? Who benefits? Who carries the risks? Who may be excluded? And what happens to those who do not possess the resources, skills, infrastructure, or bargaining power required to participate? Technology becomes genuinely transformative only when technological advancement translates into better human outcomes. These three concerns, namely sustainability, inclusivity, and technology, therefore cannot be treated independently. The most interesting questions emerge precisely when they intersect. As researchers, we are exceptionally good at identifying research gaps. Almost every research paper begins by explaining what we still need to do or still need to know about. Perhaps TTC should encourage us to think equally seriously about our impact gaps. What changes because we conducted this research? Whose journey becomes safer? Whose access improves? Which policy becomes better informed? Which transport service becomes more inclusive? Which community becomes better connected? And which assumptions does our evidence force us to reconsider? And perhaps the most difficult question of all, whose voice is still absent from the conversations through which we design the future of mobility? These questions matter because if we genuinely use the word transformative, transformation cannot simply describe a technology, a policy, an infrastructure project, or even an academic conference. Transformation must ultimately be experienced by people. I hope we leave TTC with better questions, unexpected conversations, stronger collaborations, and clearer possibilities for action. To our keynote speakers, presenters, panelists, session chairs, organizing colleagues, volunteers, and everyone who has contributed to making TTC 2026 possible, thank you. To those joining TTC for us for the first time, welcome to this community. And to the colleagues who have traveled with Trucksteady and TTC through their earlier editions, thank you for helping this community continue to evolve. As we begin, let us challenge one another to do something extraordinary, to research something extraordinary. Let us connect disciplines that do not ordinarily speak to one another. Let us connect scholarship with practice and policy. Let us question assumptions that have become comfortable simply because they remain unquestioned far too long. And above all, throughout these conversations, let us never lose sight of what people behind the system we study. Behind every discussion of transport infrastructure, mobility policy, algorithm platforms, sustainability, or service design is someone trying to reach a place, an opportunity, a livelihood, a community, or another person. If we can keep that person at the center of our discussion, then TTC 2026 will have achieved something meaningful. It is therefore my privilege as a co-chair to formally declare Transformative Transport Conference 2026 open. Welcome to TTC 2026. I wish all of you an intellectually stimulating, collaborative, genuinely transformative conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bat. Thank you. It's a pleasure to have you start the conference, and greetings to everyone here. Allow me invite our first keynote speaker, Dr. Samuel Sinapau. I assume is here. Uh, can you unmute yourself and let me just confirm you can hear me? Okay, very good. I like that. Thank you. Thank you. Spot on. Thank you. I will spare you my introduction, but I think I will just officially invite our keynote speaker, Dr. Samuel Sinapau, who is an associate professor of marketing at Melbourne Business School in Australia. He'll be speaking on when global transport platform meets local realities. Professor Samuelson is an associate professor of marketing at the Melbourne Business School. He has a background in marketing and market research and holds a PhD in marketing from University of Melbourne. Samuelson is an associate professor and he is involved in multidisciplinary research which examines how transition and transformation in people's lives, society, and marketplace affect consumer behavior and well-being. His research has been published in leading marketing and business journals such as Journal of Marketing, Journal of Consumer Research, International Journal of Marketing, Marketing Theory. He also teaches marketing and consumer behavior in the MBA. He is also the program director of Blue Nile Program, a mini MBA program designed for African Australian entrepreneurs, working professionals, and leaders of not-for-profit organizations at the Melbourne Business School. So the floor is yours, Professor Samuel Sinapau. It's a pleasure to have you at the Transformative Transport Conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel, my Oga Mugaji, Professor Mugaji, and Professor Bat, and Professor Olalekan for having me as well. Good evening from Melbourne to everybody, for wherever you are in the world, and good morning to you in the UK. I've been to your beautiful campus, and so it's lovely to be able to join you from here. I'll try and share my screen as well, so that I will be able to run through my stuff. So I'm going to try and do that. There's always a learning curve when it comes to these things, but let's see how well we go on it.
It should work.
Yeah. So I am not sharing what I want to share. I'm going to stop this and try again. So I think what I'm going to do is share a particular screen instead. That should work fine. I would hope. And that is working much better, correct? So you can see a full big screen. Can everybody see that? Okay, good. Perfect. So once again, thank you very much for having me. I'm just going to jump into it as yeah, I understand I have 30 minutes to share with you on the topic when global transport platforms meet local realities. And so I'm going to try and speak about 30 minutes so that and leave about 15 minutes for us to have a conversation. This is one of those that, even though the context of this research that I'll be presenting on is in Ghana and Africa, I'm sure many people from other emerging markets will be very familiar with many of the things I'll be talking about. And so I'll be happy to hear stories and similar experiences and even ideas that you might have of ways in which this research could be expanded. or even questions that you may have. So put it here. So this research has actually just been recently published in the Journal of Marketing. So it's always nice when you get to present research that has been published rather than one that is going through the process. So what I get to do is to share some of the key insights from there. So it's quite fresh as well because it's just been in a couple of months. So it's nice to be able to present some of the key ideas in there and even some other reflections that I've had since. And so I'm just putting this here. If you want to read the more academic, deeper academic versions of it, then you could obviously check out the paper. And it's JM, which is tends to be written in a more accessible manner rather than, for example, in the more theory heavy marketing journals like Journal of Consumer Research and JMR and so on. So I would encourage you to look at it if you're in this space as well. But I'm going to talk to you about how I came to do this research in the first place. So I'm from Ghana and West Africa. That explains my very sexy African accent. In case you were wondering, I love this accent that he has. It's definitely nicer than Emmanuel's Nigerian accent. Yeah, this one is from Ghana. It's a very, very beautiful, sexy accent. Even Nigerians love it. And so I live in Australia, but I am from Ghana, and I was home. I think this must have been 2016, and Uber had just started operating in Ghana. Now, I'd been using Uber around the world about, about half a decade prior. For us, for one of the early adopters of Uber when it started operating in Australia and traveled around the world and used Uber. So when I got to Ghana and I found out that Uber was working, I thought, oh, cool. I don't have to have a car. I can Uber my way around. This is perfect. So I was taking Uber around and I started noticing some interesting differences that were already occurring in the market, which were very different from the typical Uber experiences I'll have around the world. And I think it all came to a head for me one day um, when I took an Uber. This Uber picked me up from a hotel to a bus station. This was about 5 a.m. in the morning. So we get to the bus station and the Uber app says, oh, that I should pay the driver, say, 50, £10 or something like that, right? So it tells me the amount that I'm supposed to pay the driver, which is something that we're all very familiar with, right? Before we book, that the app estimates the right cost for us, and then we book it, and when we arrive, usually it's more or less about the same, unless there are other things that may have happened along the road. So this was 5 a.m. Obviously, so nothing was going to change. There was no traffic. It was a smooth ride. We arrived, and as I was getting out of the car, when I was about to pay, the driver said to me, "Oh, my brother, I've come to. I drove from a very long distance from my house. It's 5 a.m. in the morning. I've come all the way to your hotel to come and pick you, take you to the bus station, and look at the money that the app is saying you should pay me. That's very, very small. Can you try and add a bit to it for me?" And I was really shocked by that experience because I thought I'd never found, it's like, oh my God, I'd never found an Uber driver ask me anywhere in the world, and I'm taking Uber on 3 continents before that, ask me for extra money apart from what the app is saying. So I was surprised by that. And everybody always asks me at the end, so what did you do? Did you give the driver the money? I did. Yes, I did give the driver the money. But on that long bus ride back, I thought about what an interesting experience, because that's what happens when academics have time on the bus, right? For hours, we start to think about things. And so I was starting to think about that experience, and I thought, I've had very, very interesting experiences about riding Uber, and this is really, really different because I bet the Uber doesn't know that this is happening. I mean, it was early on that this has happened, but at the same time, interrogated my own surprise because I'm thinking, have I become too bougie? Because this is very normal for taxi drivers in Ghana to do. You would take a taxi and then you get to a place, and the driver, based on, would renegotiate the price with you if they thought that they should probably have charged more. So in the traditional taxi system, this wasn't strange, and the driver wasn't behaving any differently from what was standard. norms, except that because I had been socialized in a particular way when it comes to Uber, and I know Uber isn't it's a more global brand, and I've experienced it around the world differently. I had that reaction, so that got me thinking about the different ways that Uber was shaping, but also being shaped by local market realities in a context like Ghana. Um, and I think that's what got me started on this journey to study this context that these findings that I'm sharing with you, which speaks very much to it. So, if you go to if I take it to context in Ghana, I'd like to explain what the taxi market looked like before Uber came along, right? So typically, what would happen is that before Uber came along, the taxi market, and there are many colonial reasons, post-colonial reasons why this happened. And the long and short of it is that in Ghana, and as in many post-colonial African countries, there was subsequent military coups and military regimes that disrupted post-colonial governance. And so what that meant is that public investment in public transport was neglected. And naturally, what that happens is that private individuals will fill the gap. And that's really what happened across the board. So in many post-colonial African countries, you would find that public transport is actually private public transport. So because it's private individuals that actually sort of fund it. And so typically, like whether it's, the mini buses and so on, the taxi market typically starts with an entrepreneurial individual, and they're mostly men. So there are gendered influences around this as well because of how men controlled capital historically and so on that I'm not going to get into. But and there are women, but they're mostly men. So what you would have is that typically you have an entrepreneurial individual, and this could be somebody who is a professional. It could be a professor. It could be somebody who works in government or somebody who trades. Anybody could do it, right? And I know that some people here in this room, sorry, in this conference, who probably own a taxi back home. I'm very sure my Ogamo Gaji would probably be one of those people. He's a rich man. So this individual will start off and then would go and buy a car. They would buy the car and they would paint it as a taxi, which was more or less one of the few rules that was really well enforced, that you had to paint the car so that we would know it's a taxi. Once they bought the taxi, then often they would use their own social networks and relationships to find a driver. And many drivers tended to be semi-literate, low-educated individuals who often will be rural urban migrants who would engage in this trade because it wasn't it's a skill, low skill, and so on and so forth. And again, that is also very gendered, and most taxi drivers are men, as you would see, and they would agree on a lease relationship. So there are two types of relationships that occur in here. There is the lease arrangement and the loan arrangement, right? The lease arrangement we call the sales, and then the loan arrangement is called work and pay. Now, the way the lease arrangement works is that, and so this entrepreneurial individual is known as the car owner. In India, they are known as taxidars, right? So some of my India colleagues would be familiar with taxidars, and this is very similar role. And so they would negotiate, and basically there were two modes of negotiation, right? The lease arrangement is basically the car owner would lease the car to the driver, and the driver would make weekly payment. Now, the plan was that the driver would make sure that they generate enough revenue so that they'll be able to pay the car owner this lease or the rent on leasing the car, and be able to make enough for themselves, right? So that was one of but then if anything happened to the car in terms of mechanical fault and all of that, because the car owner retained ownership of the car, they were responsible for maintaining the car. Now you could already see some moral hazards in there in terms of drivers doing all manner of funky things. And so the car owner segment of the market came up with what the loan arrangement, or what they called work and pay. And basically they would buy the car, and instead of leasing the car to the car owner, they would actually give it to the car owner on a loan. And they would typically be double the price of the car. So I'll buy a car for $50,000, and then I would loan it to a driver for $100,000. And then I'll give the driver 2 years to make repayment and amortize the loan and pay off. And so that was typically the practice. So that would be the arrangement that they would have. And so either way, the car owner would receive some weekly repayment. And that was the arrangement that occurred, right? And that too is another area that I think can be explored a bit more. Then the car or the driver would have to then find their own passengers, either by driving by the roadside and going on dead runs, trying to see that they could find passengers who would hail them by the street, or they might do points to point, where they might actually work in a station and pick up passengers from there, right? And everything was very cash based, because Ghana is still a very cash based economy, and so the rider would pay the driver in cash, and then the driver would make their weekly loan or lease repayments to the car owner. I think this context is really important because it automatically distinguishes from many developed markets in terms of how the taxi market operated, as well. And so this is what the market looked like. So what happens when Uber came in? When Uber arrived in 2016, some things changed and some things remained the same. One of the key things that remained the same was that the car owner didn't go away, right? So that old entrepreneurial individual who was supplying cars for taxis now thought, Uber, even better. So they started now buying cars to be used for Uber instead of to be used for taxis for multiple reasons that they thought, was more beneficial, accountability, better ways of being able to track as a global technology and so on and so forth, right? So all of these things were there. So the driver would, it was the same car owners rather than the typical, developed market where it would be individuals using their own cars, which was typical in the beginning with Ubers, or maybe taking a car loan but still owning the car. Here, it was mostly still the car owner who would buy a car, this time a private car, and over the time the market shifted where many people were buying these small cars. I'll talk about that very soon. And then they would also have to find their own drivers. But this was changed in two ways. One, Uber had a fleet system, which was that Uber was helping people find drivers. So it was not only doing the driver passenger matching, it was also doing car owner driver matching. So that could have happened, but you could also find your own car. But another significant change was that because you required a certain level of digital literacy to be able to use the Uber app, what you found was that more older, rural urban migrant, low literate, was being replaced by the younger university student, university or high school graduate, who was more literate and more digitally literate, replacing them. So even the labor changes, and this is some of the work that has been done as well by scholars in this space. You saw some of these significant labor changes. Of course, in terms of matching capabilities, the app was doing that. And so now instead of trying to go drive around and find your passengers, the app was doing this and bringing a different kind of efficiency into the market. And instead of cash payments, you could also do digital payments. And that also affected how the driver paid. And this tapped in very well with mobile money and other digital payment infrastructures that was growing rapidly in these markets, right? So these are the significant ways in which Uber changed. And I think understanding this alone tells you that just automatically you can start to see how these realities, if you mesh them with a global platform that was built for developed markets that they don't have many of these characteristics, you will start to see how some very interesting things would happen. And so that leads us to the focus of this and the research question, or what the keynote is about, is what happens when global transport platforms meet local realities and emerging market. So what we did here was use what we call an ecosystem market approach, which is that clearly this is an ecosystem, right? Ride hailing in the taxi market is an ecosystem of multiple actors and institutions. So what we wanted to do was engage all of them qualitatively. And so we interviewed Uber riders, Uber drivers, car owners, people who own their own cars, what we call driver owners, taxi drivers, the Uber country manager, and government officials, right? So these are all the key players that are impacted or are relevant in this market. If you look at the key actors, these are all of these people. But we also didn't end there. There are also government reports and records that we're interested in, from road safety data, in terms of whether there are a increment or reduction in road incidents, car registrations to see if there had been a spike in car registration or reducing the types of cars that were being registered over the period before and after Uber came into it. We're also looking at like government white papers and MOUs that they had signed with these companies and the terms and conditions, the sort of like regulatory directions that they had given or terms of direction that they had given to, or they were thinking about it, or that they had given to these platforms. Now, Uber came in and later Bolt, Yango and others came in as well. So it became a very busy market very quickly. And there are some local players, but mostly it became a two-horse race between Uber and Bolt, and Yango was more or less a third party. But we also collected a lot of news media reports because media is wonderful in terms of capturing sentiment and narratives and events and so on. So the four major news media outlets we collected, tons of all of the media reports, and we included that in our data as well. And then we also engage in participant observation, riding Ubers ourselves, going to the Uber country office, trying to see how the registered drivers, how they engage with them, multiple visits there. The one thing that I wanted to do, which my wife didn't allow me to do, was become an Uber driver to see what it's like having a driver experience. And she said, no, they drive like crazy in Ghana. You're not going to be an Uber driver. So that's where that stopped. But I thought that would have been very fascinating ethnographic experience. But anyway, that's where what we did. So I'm going to move very quickly to talk about, because I realize that I've got about half an hour to move on, to talk about what we found very quickly, and then we can think through some of the implications that we discussed, and I hope we can chat more about it. So this is more or less like the summary model from our research. Now, there are two important things that are at play here. One is, what do we know about developing or emerging market characteristics that are very salient for the operation of transport, right? On one hand. And what do we know about the characteristics of ride-hailing platforms that are also very salient when they come into these markets, right? So we referred to, so for the developing market characteristics, there are three main ones. One is that there are serious infrastructure deficits, and I don't need to belabor this point, right? Road infrastructure, internet, electricity, all of those things aren't as good compared to what you would find in more developed markets that initially these ride-hailing platforms were built for. Right. So that's one of the first things. Then there is also informality. Unlike these other markets, they say, for example, the US, where Uber originally came from, where the taxi market was very well regulated and very formal. In our markets, they are largely informal. And again, the context that I explained to you is largely informal, and even the arrangement and many of their activities are largely informal. So lots of informal players compared to more formal market. And then also there are serious regulatory voids. So there are three types of regulations when it comes to market. There's entry regulations, and there's quality regulations, so both entry and operational, right? What are the things you need to be able to enter the market and the requirement that you need to operate? The entry regulations were quite well enforced, right? You need to have a car, this and so, but not all of it in terms of like license and so on. So we all know like people from these markets who don't have the right licenses and so on and so forth. And then there is also quantity regulation. And so in many developed markets like the US and so on, there was a cap on a number of cars that could operate as taxis. In our local markets, there was no cap. And then there is also economic regulation. In many of these markets, there is also regulation of the price. So if you took a taxi in any of the places, you saw that the prices were fixed, they were metered, and they were managed. In our market, it was the wild, wild world, right? A lot of the pricing was negotiated between the rider and the driver. And so there was lots of room for driver moral hazards. And so if somebody like Prof. Bat here came to Ghana, as soon as they saw him, they're like, we've seen him in India. We would make a lot of money off him because he's a foreigner. And if I went to India, I'm probably sure they would do the same thing to me because they knew I wouldn't know, right? So all of those things were there. And so there were these regulatory voices that are there. Now, they have advantages and disadvantages. There's not necessarily deficits per se, but they were still consequential. So that's on the other hand. On the other hand, you have the platform characteristics, what we refer to as platform affordances. Basically, what did the platform enable or constrain people from doing with the platform, right? And so enable people to order rides, pay for the rides, and so on and so forth. So these are some of the key things that were there. So what we describe here, or we theorize here, is what we refer to as platform market interactions. Basically, when the platform interacts with these developing market characteristics, or what happens. And we identify three. One, and we talk about first these market interaction outcomes. Two, we talk about how it impacts the performance of the platform and where we see tensions emerge, and how do the market actors that we identified, right? The riders, the drivers, the car owners, taxi drivers, government officials, how do they respond to these, especially as it affects them? So I'll begin with the first one. The first one looks like platform market infrastructure deficiencies. It's very straightforward. Because many of the infrastructure don't work as well, they also render the platform deficient. And I think a classic example of this was the navigation. So the navigation was quite live, and it created two problems. One, the navigation, especially when you get into internet dead zones, can just go off. And so if the driver doesn't know where they are going, it becomes a problem. And suddenly it can start fights in the Uber because the thing is not working. And then they're saying to the passenger, the navigation is not working. Where do I turn from here? And the passenger will say, I don't know. What do we do? And so that creates problems there. A second part of it is that the navigation focuses on the fastest, most efficient routes to get you to where you're going, but it does not account for road quality. And the roads in many of our urban roads are horrible. And so what would happen is that the navigation will tell a driver to use a route, and the route will be horrible, and it's going to give them mechanical problems, and that will become a problem. So that was one of the key things that happened. So we could see how that created tensions. And so what happened? Well, in many instances, people accepted it that it is what it is, right? We can control, and this is just a problem that we have to live with. Um, but sometimes as well, they just try to avoid using specific platform characteristics that they thought were problematic or did not work the way they wanted because of the infrastructural system. So there are many passengers themselves who don't like using the navigation. So they'll get in the car and tell you, I don't want you to follow the navigation. I will tell you where to pass. Or drivers who would say to the passenger, I think we shouldn't use the navigation because it's not always reliable. Can you let us revert back to the old system where you tell me where we are going to go? Give me the directions to your place, right? So we see some avoidance of it. One of the ones that they avoid very much is cash payments because it's a very card payment, because it's a very cash-based economy. People just want to be paid in cash. But sometimes, many of the foreigners many people would book an Uber and it's card payment. And the drivers realize that because the card payment first goes to Uber. And instead of Uber paying the money back to the drivers, it holds on to the money to offset service fees. The drivers hate that. Oh, they hate that because it affects their cash flow. So what they do is that when you order a ride, and they would call the customer and ask the customer, are you going to pay with cash or card? And if they say card, they would cancel the ride because they wanted to pay card. In fact, that actually happened to me in Ghana. I was in Ghana about a month ago. I ordered an Uber courier to pick up at something and take. And when he came and he realized that it was a card-based payment, he said, no, I'm not going. I need money to go and buy medication for my girlfriend who is really sick right now. That's why I even took this ride. So cancel it. I can do it. I'm going to pick another ride that is coming in. So that happens quite often, right? So that's avoidance part. Okay. So then the next part is informalization. So the market is informal, and here is a platform that is very formal, right? Because it documents everything. It documents the driver who did what when you picked the ride. Whereas in the other system, if you took a taxi, it doesn't document anything. You don't know the driver doesn't know you. Nobody knows where they picked you up from, where they dropped you. But Uber documents all of these things. So what you start to see is a formal system that now is formalizing an informal market, right? Because now everything is documented. And even pricing is dictated, right? The platform is not telling us how much to charge for pricing. Now, what is also happening is that the informal market is also now shaping the formal platform. And why does this happen? The car owner system. Because inherently, that informal arrangement between the car owner and the driver is imposed onto Uber now. Because I expect my Uber driver to make money off of Uber. So whenever Uber dictates a price, they're not only dictating a price that is consequential for the driver, they're dictating a price that is consequential for the car owner as well. So when a driver sees the revenue they make from Uber, they're not thinking, oh, Uber is great, they help me make this revenue. They're thinking, oh, Uber is great, they may help me make this revenue minus my car owner's cost. And because of that, I'm not making enough. So that informal arrangement was starting to also have a big implication on particularly the fact that Uber was determining the prices for things. So we start to see how some of these things were changing, right? And then also, for example, the reduced number of interactions in cars and so on and so forth. So what are some of the ways that the market actors responded? Many of them adapted. There are those, for example, who, for example, to avoid I spoke about the switch to small cars. When they realized that Uber's prices were too low relative to their cost, they realized that they could not use standards, cars to do it. So they started importing these very small Korean cars with very low fuel usage, so that because Uber requires you to do multiple rides in order to be able to make money. So what happens is that you started to see an entire market shift in terms of the type of vehicles that they were using, because they found that it was cheaper to use these type of cars in order to be able to make multiple trips before you need to refill, because fuel was one of the most consequential operational costs, right? So that's one adaptation. Substitution is, people were substituting one platform for the other, or sometimes customers would switch to traditional taxis, especially with surge pricing. Sometimes with surge pricing, it's cheaper to take a local taxi than to use Uber. And then there's resistance, which is what we tend to see: protest. So drivers coming together to protest it, because like Uber is now controlling it. And that's where we see across the world, where we see drivers saying, look, we are actually employees of Uber, and they don't treat us as such, and they're not treating us well, but they insist that we are only contractors. This is one of the biggest labor disputes around the world. And this is potentially because these guys are now formalizing a market and controlling how we capture and how we capture value and how much of the captured value we get to keep, right? And so that's consequential. The last one, which I found particularly interesting about among all of them, is that unintentionally, the platform was having a more regulatory impact on the market than the existing regulation. Because the market, and this is ironic because everywhere else, particularly in developed market where regulations are stronger, Uber is the bad boy, right? They are trying to avoid regulation, fight regulators, operate on the fringes of regulation, or try to say, oh, we are not taxis, so we should not be regulated like taxis. But they come into a market where the rules are lax. And Uber actually has more stringent regulations, because Uber requires you to meet certain sort of entry requirement, have driver's license. They require you to take a test and pass the test, and customer service and so on and so forth. And also they have ability to have oversight to make sure that you're complying, which is one of the key functions of regulation. Many of the time, the reason why regulations are not well enforced in our country is that we lack the capability to have oversight to see if people are really complying. But Uber knows, they know if you misbehave, a customer will report you. And importantly, they could sanction you if you did not comply. And so, and this was something that nobody could do. If you took a taxi and the driver was rude to you, what are you going to do? They were rude to you. You might probably never meet them again. But if you took an Uber and the driver was rude to you, that was very consequential. You could report them and they would be in trouble. And so suddenly, Uber was having what we call affordance-based regulation, which the platform has started regulating the market in a way that even government couldn't do. So suddenly, Uber was starting to be seen as the regulator of the market, right? And that was deeply, deeply consequential. So what happened? One, the government started to see this. So what did the government do? This government has started giving more regulatory responsibilities to Uber to do, and which obviously annoyed Uber to no end, because we know how much they don't like regulation. But this is because they did not realize that they have become regulators of the market. And then there are drivers who are also trying to subvert Uber's regulation by themselves. So one of the classic examples is that a driver told us about a ploy among drivers that they thought that Uber was more strict than Bolt. And so they like Bolt more because Bolt was more lax. Or even the regulation became a sort of competitive advantage. So what would typically happen is that if they took a customer on Uber, they were deliberately rude to the customer because the customer is going to say Uber drivers are rude, and then they would leave Uber. But when they pick a customer on Bolt, they're exceedingly polite to the customer, trying to show how they. So these were more subversive tactics that they would use. I didn't have time to show you all the quotes, but you see all of that in the paper if you were more interested in it, right? So these are some of the things that you see when these local market realities come in contact with the global market. So what are the implications of this? Well, the managerial implications of this are very clear. One, infrastructure deficits can make platform affordances not work as intended. So, what do we recommend? We recommend that where possible, they should invest in improving the infrastructure that their platform runs on. We've seen Facebook try to do this by improving internet connectivity. We've seen, Starlink try to do this and build offline capabilities, right? Because they know the more people can access the platform, the more users they can get. So they're building the infrastructure that is needed to help them do that. This is hard to do, but where possible, especially as they get bigger, it may be useful for them to consider that. And this also includes offline capabilities, particularly with the navigation and the pricing. Because one of the challenges is that if you're in a place where your internet connection is bad, you will not have ride requests come through. And that happened quite a number of the drivers complained about that. We go to this place, the internet connection is great, we're not getting rides at all. So they may need to develop offline capabilities. But we also need to consider how poor infrastructure could also be included in pricing, right? If you're going to use a route where the road is bad, you want to make sure that you're going to give drivers higher. We've talked about the informalization part, and so we talk about the drive. It is very important that Uber considers or ride-hailing platforms consider the cost and benefits of formalization, because they might only see the benefits, but it can have some cost for them in terms of reputation, in terms of how consumers themselves might feel. For example, if you come to Ghana right now, everybody knows what Uber rides are, and they're these small cars, and that has branded Uber in terms of their image, which is not an image they are happy with. In fact, their company manager said as much, that this is not an image that we want, because in many places Uber is seen as a bit more sophisticated than that. But here, it's really dropped the brand image. And so it's really important to manage that. And then in affordance-based regulation, the key recommendation to them is that instead of being avoiders of regulations, in many developing emerging markets, they unintentionally and automatically become the regulators of the market. And so we encourage them to embrace and lead regulation, because that way they can create a more equal playing field. And regulators would be happy. So rather than allow things to happen, you can lead the regulation that your platform is already giving, and you can create a more equal playing platform. And I think that's really important. And we also reflect on other sharing platforms and other non-sharing platforms that these have implications for. Okay, again, all of that is in the paper. We also, and this is something that I will have to admit that reviewers pushed us to do, so that's what we did, which is basically reflect on what this means for riders and drivers. So for riders, obviously, there's a lot of benefits from this, right? The formalization benefits, the safety guarantees that they get. And whether it's good or bad, for the most part, it's better for riders, and that's why you rarely see riders protest against Uber or ride-hailing platforms, because it's biased towards them. For drivers, it's a different thing altogether, right? It's a mixed bag. On one hand, the prices that Uber dictates is really low, but on the other hand, they also bring more efficiency in pricing, which means that it's faster, it's quicker, you don't spend time negotiating with, and so on. There is more surveillance. Uber has this more big brother hegemony, oversight of drivers that is uncomfortable for many of them. But at the same time, that's also important because it helps keep the drivers safe. There were periods where people were robbing drivers and taking their cars from them. So somebody would take a ride and take you to a dangerous neighborhood, and then they would put you a gun or a knife on you and take your car away from you. And all of these sort of Uber surveillance help them arrest these people much quicker compared to if it hadn't happened. So it's a mixed bag. And then again, if you try to resist Uber and you push these platforms out, you also lose out in the big market. So it's a bit of a mixed bag for them. I think for government and policy makers, it's very consequential. I think particularly in emerging markets where the government and policymakers lack the capability or the willingness to enforce regulation. I think the smart thing is just to indirectly regulate the markets through the ride-hailing platforms, right? So, and it's really, and we start to see some of that semblance in Ghana, but they haven't done it deliberately. But I think it's one of the smartest ways to do it. If anybody is angry, they will be angry with the platforms. If, but it's a very, very smart way to do it. And it's also a very quick way to formalize the market. Because here you are, you've got a big chunk of your transportation market that is informal. You can't tax them, you can have oversight, you can plan with them, you don't have the numbers. It's really difficult to have any oversight and control over them. And we've seen this happening in some emerging or low developed markets like Greece, Italy, and so on, where basically the government just mandated ride hailing everybody to list on the ride hailing platforms. So if you go to these countries, and the same thing happened in Ivory Coast. In Ivory Coast, the government just said to Uber, if you're going to operate here, you have to onboard all our taxi drivers. You have to let taxis operate too. And so what that happens is that whether it's, rental cars, everything, they are all on the platform. And it gives you a very good way to regulate it, the market, because otherwise it's very, very difficult. And government does not, we know we can never trust government to build and maintain apps anyway, right? It's going to be politicized very quickly. It's going to become very problematic. It's not their core competency, but it could do that. And so all the government needs to do is to build the right infrastructure to support them, improve the roads, improve internet connectivity. So those infrastructure that the platforms need to operate, just make sure those things are available as much as possible. And then when you do that, that way regulation does not become a point of competition among ride-hailing platforms, where one is trying to make the regulations easier or the enforcement easier on drivers. And then the one who is trying to do the better thing gets into trouble because drivers are trying to sabotage it. If you said to all ride hailing platforms, all your cars need to have comprehensive insurance, that creates an equal playing platform. But as it is, it's not. So Uber requires comprehensive insurance, Bolt requires third party. Which one do the drivers like? They like both because it's cheaper operational cost. But if government's involved, they can fix those things. Anyway, I've gone slightly longer than I thought, but I would end here and I'll be open to having conversations and questions. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm sure you can hear me and you are ready for my return game. Let's start with your accent. Who told you what is the empirical evidence that says Ghanaians has got sexy accents? Yes. As far as I'm concerned, there is no published peer review article to verify that. So that is just your claim. So I think we can proceed with that. No response. No response.
No,
No.
no response. Yes, because it's it's a universal declaration, so there is no need to debate on this on fact.
Well, thank you so much for this session. I guess I like the way you're able to connect it with so many countries, and this is something practical. But there was one key word which I want us to maybe unpack a bit because we discussed this yesterday, and it's about regulation. And you are saying something about formal sector shaping informal system. How do you see regulation in an unregulated market? So let's use Uber for example. Can you share some insight into how they've been able to come around and like influence the market? Was there any kind of government resistance? So maybe linking it back to the Ivory Coast Cote d'Ivoire thing. So the whole idea is how were you able to, from your research or your engagement, the interaction between the culture of the people, the need for them to do business, and then the ultimate regulations coming? How does those three, regulation, the culture, the cash based, and also the need for us to do business, how do they connect?
So I think it's a great question, and I'm not sure I'll be able to do full justice to it in a short period of time. But to be
Okay.
brief, I think the main impetus for adoption and
Hmm.
this is largely researched in the ride-hailing platform literature. So I'm not going to go too much into it. It's just benefits outweighing cost. People looked at it and thought, there are all these benefits of using ride hailing, whether as a driver or as a rider. I'm going to use that, right? And so, and even the same with car owners, right? Who are for the starting point of investment
Yeah.
because they supply the cars. A car owner looks at it and think, if I have a taxi and my driver goes off, there's no record of how many
Mm.
rides they've done. The driver can just tell me I was sick today and I didn't. There's just no record of anything. But with Uber, I can log in into their driver app. In fact, I would they ask for access to the driver app, and I can see everything, right, that they've done on the day, and I could even match it even in terms of mileage on the car that is logged on the car to be able to know. So you can tell me you were sick. And then you go off and drive and make money on your own. So at the end of the day, it's a cost benefit analysis that led to adoption. In terms of regulation, I
Mm-hmm.
talked about the three types of regulation: the
Yeah.
entry regulation, the quality regulation, the economic, and the quantity regulation. So particularly on the quality in terms of
Yeah.
service standards, having oversight about what everybody is doing, making sure that people who are taxi drivers have the right license, they renew them every year, and they have the right training. All of those things are things that automatically Uber did, and I think it's a residue from the developed market they came from, right? In the
Mm.
developed markets, these were standards that were then, so they brought them and it automatically helped. So I think one of the ways in which regulators can do that is they can look at all the regulatory gaps that they
Yeah.
have across these three domains and just go to work with the ride hailing apps and say, we need you to meet these requirements.
Okay.
And we need you to push that onto the market. And I think that
Mm.
will be one of the ways in which it would work. And I
That's
think
fine.
people will continue to use it anyway.
Thank you. I've got one question before I open the floor. It's about the card payment. I like the
Yeah.
story you shared also about drivers saying we want cash, but the regulators or the platform are looking for card payment. So beyond just Ghana, how do you think this can shape the integration of technology into transport services provision? So again, your platform wants card, your culture wants cash. So beyond just Uber, how do you envisage this balancing this dichotomy between what the culture wants and what you as a platform owner wants?
Right. I think Uber are deeply rational when it comes to mode of payment.
Okay,
They have card payment because from the developed markets that they came,
they
digital
brought
payment
that.
was
Yeah.
more the norm. And so those capabilities already exist on the platform, right? And so typically when people are signed up, they get the options. And so they may use all of it. But I think Uber are quite agnostic whether payment comes through cash and they have ways to make sure the drivers pay the money. So they are
Mm.
quite agnostic when it comes to it. But what I think is going to happen down, like considering how much in many cash-based economies, and this is happens around the world, people tend to resist non-cash digital
Yeah.
payment. It may be sensible for Uber to look into the ways in which it might build those primacies. But I think that would change. So for example, a typical example is mobile money. I think there are many
Yeah.
countries where that is becoming quite popular, but they don't have them on these platforms. And I think if they did that, it would also open up the options because I think many drivers will be happy with mobile money
Mobile
even if
money.
it's not
That's fine.
cash. Exactly. So
Thank
there is room for them to integrate technology that have stronger diffusion in terms of payment in
you.
particular cultures there, and that will make them successful. In fact, it was one of the ways in which Grab was able to kick Uber's ass in Singapore, for example, just because of like that strong integration that it had across platforms.
Mm.
So that's
Thank you.
how I see it would do it. Yeah.
Yeah, on that, I know this is not just a question, but perhaps something to reflect on. I wonder what they are doing in Kenya because Kenya has got this this mobile money. So I'm
Yeah.
not so sure how, if there is Uber and if there's any way they've been able to match that up. But I guess that's something to explore further. I've got so many
Absolutely.
hands who wants to ask you question. I see Joe Emmanuel Nana Otto, who sounds like a Ghanaian. So I think I will give him the floor. Let's see what he wants to ask. Then after that, Philip. Joe, are you able to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, I've been able to unmute myself, and thank you
Okay.
so much for the opportunity. Congratulations, Professor Samuel. It was a nice presentation. And indeed, I'm from Ghana, a PhD student from University of Cape Coast in transport, and currently in German on an exchange study on mobility and infrastructure. I'm happy to hear your presentation on Uber, which is a new thing, a new development, which I call it a technological innovation in the transport industry, in ride hailing or car sharing. But my question has to do with the infrastructure deficit, where you were focusing on uh, the maps, the customers not being able to maybe make use of it to get to their destination. Uh, what would be your recommendation or your suggestion to ensure that, since this is a new trend in the transport industry in Ghana, uh, what what is the awakening call for town planning or city planners to ensure that things could be well streamlined for pedestrians, passengers to easily get to their place? And I'll be glad to also get in touch with you. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I mean, look at that sexy accent, right? It's beautiful Ghanaian accent. I'm gonna try and keep all the answers as brief as possible because I'm cognizant that you have to move on to other things. So, if the answers are not good, I'm happy to, and Emmanuel can share my contact as well with everyone. I'm happy to stay in touch and chat over these things, and it's still an active area of research for me. So, quick response to your question, my Ghanaian brother. One is the recommendation is for the government obviously to invest more in these infrastructure that these platforms need. And I think the more they do that, the more it becomes attractive, the more they become successful, the more they can also have the ability to scale. So at the moment, you tend to see them operate in urban areas that tend to have better capability. So in Ghana, for example, they work well in Accra, Kumasi quite a bit, Takrady quite a bit, but that's the end of it. But and in Cape Coast, not as much. So if we could expand, and I think internet is the easier one, we could do it. But I also see opportunities for collaboration. So, for example, they could whether it's government, so it could be three-way. And this is what made M-Pesa and mobile money really take off. It was a multi-stakeholder collaboration to make it happen. So I see if the ride-hailing platforms, government, and mobile telcos come together, they could collaborate and build infrastructure that improves, for example, internet connectivity, that would help navigation work as well. And government just really invest in road infrastructure, which I know is a big ask. So those would be some of the quicker, easier hanging fruit. I think collaboration. The networks also benefit, right? Because the more people use data, the more you benefit. And you could even have specific data packages for ride-hailing platform and so on and so forth. And that could be all very good ways for you to sort of grow your addressable market from a strategic perspective. So those would be my quick responses.
Thank you for that. Because of our time, so many hands are raised up. So if you can just put your question in the chat. But let me ask, I've seen Philip Alimo. Yes, again, a quick question. We should be going to the next section in the next 6 minutes. So again, Dr. Philip, if you can be very quick, and maybe Dr. Fagbero as well. So just quick questions so that we can just move to the next section. Dr. Philip?
Thank you very much for the presentation. My question has to do with
we can't hear your question.
Hello? Yes. Okay. Sorry for the. So
Okay.
my question is that how do you foresee the applicability of this platformization to the trotro sector as well? Now you talk about the taxi and the Uber sector. I'm thinking of how we can apply this in the trotro, because we still have this issue of regulation and formalization of this sector, which could also help to bring sustainability, as it can carry many passengers at the same time compared to people driving their own cars. Yes.
Yeah. And I can tell you for a fact this is within the ambition of both Uber, like the ride-hailing platform, and government. So the government officials have talked about how much they would love to do that. And Uber has also talked about that's the goal. If we can get even those guys on board, that would be great. So I think it's within the horizon in terms of the thought. So yes, that I would say that's possible. And they've done it in other countries successfully.
That's right.
Right.
Thank you for that short answer. Lastly, I think regulation could also be another thing to consider in that part, but that's a different conversation. Dr. Fagbenro, please, the last question before we allow our Australian keynote speaker to go to bed. Yes. Are you able to unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
Okay, thank you very much, sir.
Welcome.
Appreciating the prof and the speaker. My question just has to do with the issue of quantity regulation. I have been to Ghana, Kumasi, and Accra even last month, and I noticed that in terms of the quality of the Uber operation to my own country, Nigeria, it varies. In Ghana, Uber does not usually switch on the air condition for users, while in Nigeria, it's not like that. But my issue is that the regulatory aspect of Uber in Nigeria, the government want to regulate it, but when the government, Uber does not want to open its books or record to the government, in the sense that the moment you know how much we are making, how you see our financial figure, you will be able to tax us heavily, and this will cascade into what the commuters are paying. What is your own submission in that little space? Uber is trying to keep their record because of taxation.
Okay, I think I get
Yeah,
it very quickly.
please
So
go on.
they don't turn on the ACs for cost reasons. That's the quick answer to the reason why it's too expensive. And the other one is that I think these are ways in which governments have to be a bit bullish. And particularly at the point of entry. Of course, they're not going to open their books to you, but you can mandate it in different ways. So I think that's where I would quickly answer. I would love to hear Dr. Bhatt's question, Sundanshu, because I saw your hand up earlier. I would love
Doc,
to hear what question you have. So if
Dr.
it's okay,
Bat is the conference chair, so I thought we can jump him
we can
and
skip in. I would love to hear his
but that's
question
fine.
because
That's fine. Since you requested for his Indian accent, maybe you want to
yes,
compare. But let's say,
yes.
Dr. Bat. Oh, not now. You are mute. You are mute.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much. Am I audible?
Yep.
Yes.
Yes. Dr. Samuelson, thank you very much for that presentation. If you were to tell me that this entire study was conducted in India, I would trust you completely because much of the finding is so generalizable to our context as well. What I'm very curious to understand is about the unions and the driver associations. Now, this is a very important phenomena, a barrier for adoption of Uber in our context. So, how does it work in your context that you study?
I love that question, and I'll try and brief as much as possible. So it's weak. So it's much stronger in the minibus spaces, but with the taxis, they're quite weak and fragmented, and that has enabled. So they couldn't even come together to be able to mandate a few things. Now the challenge for them also is that really behind the scenes government is happy with what Uber is doing. So because they would desire them to formalize them as much as possible. And the union stance is that, these guys are killing our business, so stop them. So I think if they could also reorganize their priorities. So for example, could they build their own platforms? And that goes to the question that Olawale was asking as well. Could they build their own platforms, or could they even use that union power to collaborate with Uber towards better ends for them? That could potentially be it. But in Ghana, they're weak. I think when they try to switch to the minivans, the buses, those transport unions are really strong because by their nature, they were forced to operate from bus stations. And because they were at that central location, it was easier for you to form unions because the person would definitely come to the bus station to pick and drop passengers, right? So you meet them compared to taxis that more roamed around. So it's easier to build. And so that's where I think that the unions would have a big say when it comes time to sort of because that's a stronger union. So I'd love to chat with you about that sometime, but this has been great. And I'm very happy to stay in touch with anybody, whether email, LinkedIn or WhatsApp. I'm happy to stay in touch and chat more about this. Thank you
That's
very
fine.
much.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to have you. Yes, I've really followed your work for many years, and it's nice to finally have you on our platform to speak about this work. Yes, I can imagine how much effort has gone into this, the sweat and the struggles. But again, thank you so much. I hope you can start reflecting on the need to be an Uber driver. Maybe now you can discuss that at home, saying, baby, I have published this research. Now let me go and become an Uber driver as an
Yeah.
adjunct Uber driver. But for now, thank you so much. We really appreciate your presence. Thank you. We'll surely be in touch. I have shared your profile on the chat. So watch out for those emails. Go and charge your phone. Many calls will start coming. Emails will start coming. But once again, thank you so much. And I think I would like to ask everybody to also appreciate you and say thank you. So we'll be moving on to the next session now. So thank you. I will close this meeting now. Then I will open it up so that we can start the next session. Thank you, everyone, and see you at the breakout session. Thank you.